Close the gates. No one enters tonight. The order left Duke Sebastian Blackthorn's lips without hesitation, his voice as cold and final as the winter storm raging beyond the iron walls of Blackthorn Hall, where wind howled across the frozen hills and snow fell in relentless sheets, burying the world in silence. Below, torches flickered against stone as servants hurried to obey, their boots echoing across the courtyard, while from the high balcony Sebastian stood motionless, his gloved hands resting against the frostbitten railing, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond as if daring anything to challenge his command. For years, nothing had, not since the night he learned that mercy was a weakness men like him could not afford. And yet tonight, something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the quiet before something breaks. It began with a faint sound, almost lost beneath the storm, a dull, uneven knock against the great iron gates. Once, then again, weaker this time, as though whatever remained outside was running out of strength. The guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, but none moved to disobey the Duke's command, not when his word was law and his indifference well known. And yet the sound came again, softer now, followed by silence so complete it felt unnatural. Sebastian's jaw tightened, his gaze narrowing as he leaned forward ever so slightly, a rare crack in his stillness. And then he saw it, a small, unmoving shape crumpled against the base of the gates, nearly swallowed by the drifting snow, a figure that should have meant nothing to him, just another stranger lost to the storm, another life beyond the reach of his concern. And for a long moment he did nothing, because that was who he had become, a man who watched rather than intervened, a man who had buried whatever impulse once urged him to act. But then the wind shifted, lifting a strand of dark hair from the figure's face, revealing pale skin against the white ground. And something about that stillness, that absolute lack of resistance, unsettled him in a way he could not name. "Your Grace," one of the guards called cautiously from below, "the gates are nearly secured." And Sebastian said nothing at first, his silence stretching until even the storm seemed to wait, until finally, with a quiet exhale that vanished into the cold, he spoke again, his voice lower now, edged with something unfamiliar. "Stop." The single word cutting through the courtyard like a blade, halting every movement at once. And after a pause that felt longer than it should have, he added, "Bring her inside." The command shocking enough that the guards froze before rushing to obey, pulling open the heavy gates just enough to drag the unconscious girl from the snow, her body limp, her clothes soaked through with ice. And as they carried her across the threshold into the dim glow of the hall, Sebastian turned away from the balcony, already stepping back into the shadows of his domain, telling himself it was nothing, just a moment's distraction, a decision that meant nothing at all. And yet somewhere beneath the weight of his control, something had already begun to shift, because for the first time in years, he had broken his own rule, and he did not yet understand what it would cost him. The fire had been burning for nearly an hour when she finally stirred, the flames casting a soft, unsteady glow across the vast chamber, as if unsure they belonged in a place so accustomed to cold. Servants moved quietly around her, removing her frost-stiffened cloak and replacing it with dry blankets, their hands careful but distant, as though afraid of what they had been ordered to save. At the far end of the room, Duke Sebastian Blackthorn stood in silence, his presence commanding even in stillness, watching not with concern but with a measured, almost clinical attention, as though trying to understand something that did not fit within the rigid boundaries of his world. She should have been ordinary, just another unfortunate soul caught in a winter storm. And yet something about her stillness, the way she seemed untouched even in weakness, unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss. When her eyes finally opened, it was not with panic or confusion, but with a slow, steady awareness, as though she had expected to wake in a stranger's domain and had already prepared herself for it. Her gaze moved across the room, taking in the towering stone walls, the heavy velvet drapes, the flicker of candlelight reflecting off polished wood, until at last it found him. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not recognition, but a quiet acknowledgement that neither of them belonged in the other's world. She pushed herself up slightly, the movement weak but deliberate, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket as if anchoring herself to the present. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, carrying a clarity that did not match her condition. "You should not have brought me here." The words surprising not only the servants, who froze mid-step, but the Duke himself, whose expression did not change, though something in his gaze sharpened. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, his boots echoing softly against the stone floor, closing the distance just enough to make his presence undeniable. "You were at my gate," he replied, his tone even, stripped of any warmth. "That made it my concern." She held his gaze for a moment longer than most would dare, then lowered it, not in submission, but in quiet calculation, as though weighing something unseen. "No," she said softly, almost to herself. "It made you a target." The room fell silent at her words, the fire crackling faintly in the background as if the only thing willing to break the tension, and Sebastian studied her more closely now, not as a stranger, but as a question that demanded an answer. There was no fear in her, no desperation clinging to her voice, only a quiet certainty that suggested she understood something he did not, and that alone was enough to shift the balance of the room in a way no one else seemed to notice. "You assume much for someone who nearly froze to death," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, edged with something that might have been curiosity. Though he would not have named it as such, she allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch her lips, though it did not reach her eyes. "And you assume I was trying to survive." The words lingered in the air long after she fell silent, leaving behind a weight that could not be easily dismissed. And for the first time in years, Sebastian Blackthorne found himself facing something he could not control, not the storm beyond his walls, not the fate of a stranger within them, but the quiet, undeniable sense that the decision he had made on that frozen night had already begun to unravel something far deeper than he intended. The silence that followed her words did not fade quickly. It settled into the room like a second presence, pressing against the walls, lingering in the space between them as the fire continued its quiet struggle against the cold. And for a moment no one moved, as if even the servants understood that something unseen had shifted beyond their understanding. Sebastian did not look away from her, though every instinct honed over years of control urged him to dismiss her, to reduce her to something simple, something manageable. But she refused to become that, not in the way she held herself, not in the calm steadiness of her breathing, not even in the weakness that should have defined her. "You speak as though you know what waits beyond these walls," he said at last, his voice low, measured, each word placed with precision, and she lifted her gaze again, meeting his without hesitation, the firelight catching in her eyes, revealing not fear, but something far more unsettling, a quiet certainty. "I do not need to know," she replied, her tone soft but unwavering. "I only need to know they will not stop." A faint crease appeared between his brows, the smallest indication that her words had reached him, though he would not acknowledge it aloud. And yet the room itself seemed to respond, the distant wind pressing harder against the windows, the storm refusing to be ignored. One of the servants shifted uneasily, glancing toward the heavy doors as if expecting them to open at any moment. But Sebastian raised a hand without looking away from her, a silent command that stilled the room once more. "You assume they will come here," he said, though the question beneath his words was not for her, but for himself, a calculation already forming behind his controlled expression, and she exhaled slowly, her fingers loosening slightly against the blanket as if she had expected this moment. "You took me in without asking who I was," she said quietly. That was enough. The simplicity of her answer lingered longer than it should have, echoing against the certainty he had built his life upon, because it suggested something he did not wish to consider, that his decision had not been contained within the walls of his home, that it had already reached beyond them. He turned away then, not abruptly, but with deliberate control, as though reclaiming the distance he had allowed to slip, his gaze moving toward the tall windows where frost traced delicate patterns across the glass, the storm outside as relentless as ever, and yet no longer distant, no longer separate from what stood within. "You will remain here until the weather clears," he said, his voice returning to its familiar cold authority, though it no longer carried the same finality. "After that, you will leave." The words were meant to close the matter, to restore order, but something in the room resisted that closure, something in the way she watched him now, not with gratitude, not with defiance, but with a quiet understanding that unsettled him more than either would have. "If I leave," she said softly, "they will follow me." He did not turn back immediately, his hand resting against the cold stone beside the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. A man who had built his life on distance and control, now faced with a choice that threatened both. "Then you should not have come here," he replied after a moment, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. And behind him, her voice came again, softer this time, almost lost beneath the wind. "I did not choose this place," she said, "but you did." And that was the truth he could not ignore, the one thing that settled deeper than the storm, deeper than her presence. The quiet realization that this had not been an accident, not entirely, that something in him had answered when he should have remained silent. And now, whether he accepted it or not, the consequence of that choice had already crossed his threshold, and it was no longer something he could simply send away. The storm did not weaken as the night deepened. It pressed harder against the stone walls as though testing the strength of everything within, and inside Blackthorn Hall the air carried a tension that no fire could soften, because something far more unsettling than the winter cold had taken root. Sebastian remained by the window long after her words had faded, his reflection staring back at him through the frost-lined glass. A man who had spent years ensuring that every decision he made was deliberate, controlled, untouched by impulse. And yet the choice he had made only hours before refused to settle into that same certainty. Behind him, the quiet movements of the servants resumed, though more cautiously now, as if the presence of the girl had altered the very rhythm of the house. And when one of them stepped forward to offer her a cup of warmed broth, she accepted it with steady hands, her fingers no longer trembling despite everything she had endured, a detail that did not escape his notice even without turning. "You should rest," the servant murmured gently, but the girl did not drink immediately, her gaze drifting once more toward the tall figure at the window, as though she were measuring the distance between them in ways that had nothing to do with space. Sebastian finally turned, slow and deliberate, reclaiming the room with a single movement, his eyes settling on her again with that same sharp, assessing calm. But something beneath it had shifted, something quieter and far more dangerous than anger or suspicion. "You have said enough to suggest you understand your situation," he said, his voice steady, though it carried a weight that had not been there before. "Then you will explain it." The request was not raised, not forceful, and yet it carried the authority of a man accustomed to answers, and for a moment it seemed as though she might refuse, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup, her gaze lowering not in submission, but in thought. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less certain. "They believe I carry something that does not belong to them," she said, choosing her words carefully, "and they will not leave until they are certain I do not." The simplicity of her explanation did not lessen its impact. If anything, it made it more difficult to dismiss, because it offered just enough truth to be dangerous, and not enough to be understood. Sebastian studied her in silence, weighing not just her words, but the way she spoke them, the absence of panic, the deliberate restraint, as though she were revealing only what she chose and nothing more. "And what is it they believe you have?" he asked, his tone unchanged, though his attention sharpened in a way that few would notice. And she lifted her gaze once more, meeting his directly, the firelight reflecting in her eyes in a way that made them seem almost unreadable. "If I tell you," she said quietly, "you will not let me leave." The statement hung between them, not as a question, but as a certainty, and for the first time since she had crossed his threshold, Sebastian did not respond immediately, because she had seen through something he had not yet admitted to himself. The silence stretched, filled only by the steady crackle of the fire and the distant roar of the storm, until at last he spoke, his voice lower now, more controlled than before. "You assume I would keep you here," he said, though the words lacked the conviction they once would have carried, and she gave the faintest shake of her head, not in disagreement, but in quiet understanding. "No," she replied, "I assume you already have." And in that moment, something within the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable. as though the line between choice and consequence had quietly disappeared, leaving behind only the realization that whatever had begun the moment he ordered the gates to open had not ended when she crossed them. It had only just begun to take shape, and neither of them could yet see how far it would reach. The fire had burned lower, its warmth no longer filling the vast chamber, but clinging instead to the space closest to the hearth, leaving the far corners of the room swallowed in shadow. And within that dim quiet, the distance between them seemed to stretch even as neither of them moved away. Sebastian stood where he had been, his presence steady, controlled, yet no longer untouched, because her words had settled into him in a way he could not dismiss. Not when they echoed too closely to a truth he had spent years refusing to acknowledge, that control was never as absolute as it seemed. She remained seated, the blanket drawn loosely around her shoulders, the untouched broth cooling in her hands, her gaze no longer fixed on him but lowered slightly, as though she had already said what mattered and would offer nothing more unless he chose to press further. For a moment, he considered ending it there, turning away, restoring the distance that had defined his world, but the thought did not bring the certainty it once would have, and that alone was enough to hold him in place. "You speak in half-truths," he said finally, his voice quieter now, though no less precise, and she exhaled softly, the faintest hint of weariness touching her expression, not from fear, but from the weight of restraint. "Because full truths change things," she replied, her tone even, as if stating something simple rather than something that carried consequence. His gaze sharpened, the line of his jaw tightening slightly as he stepped closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to close the distance that had once protected him. "Everything changes something," he said, and this time there was no question beneath his words, only a quiet challenge. She looked up at him then, really looked, as though measuring not his title or his authority, but the man beneath it, and for the first time, something in her composure shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a breath held too long finally released. "Then you already understand why I cannot tell you," she said softly, and that answer, more than any other, unsettled him. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the windows, a low, constant force that refused to fade, and somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of movement carried through the night, too subtle for most to notice, but not for him. His attention flickered toward the sound for the briefest moment before returning to her, his instincts sharpening, not with fear, but with awareness, the kind that came from knowing something unseen had begun to move closer. "They are already near," he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming too late to ignore, and she did not deny it, did not react with surprise, only lowered her gaze again, as if confirming what she had expected all along. "They do not wait," she said quietly. "They follow." The simplicity of her words settled into the room with a weight that no one could escape, and Sebastian felt something shift within him once more, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but something far more dangerous, something that resembled resolve. He turned away abruptly this time, crossing the room with measured steps, each one deliberate, each one pulling him further from the man he had been only hours before, until he reached the heavy doors and paused, his hand resting against the cold iron handle as though grounding himself in something solid. For a moment, he said nothing, and then, without turning back, he gave a quiet order that carried through the room with unmistakable authority. "Double the watch," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but no longer detached. "No one approaches without my command." The servants moved immediately, their hesitation gone, replaced by the instinct to obey, and as the doors opened to carry his order into the halls beyond, the cold air that slipped inside felt sharper than before, as if the storm itself had drawn closer, behind him. She remained still, her presence no longer that of a stranger passing through, but something far more anchored, something that had already begun to take root within walls that had never allowed such things before. And though he did not look back at her, did not acknowledge the quiet pull that had begun to form, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The moment he chose to protect her, he had already chosen everything that would follow, and there was no longer a path that led back to who he had been before. The doors closed behind the last servant with a heavy finality, sealing the chamber once more in firelight and shadow, But the stillness that followed no longer felt like safety. It felt like anticipation, as though the walls themselves were listening, waiting for something yet to arrive. Sebastian did not return to his place by the window. Instead, he remained near the center of the room, his posture composed but no longer distant, as if he had shifted from observer to something far more involved, something he had not intended to become. Across from him, she watched in silence, her earlier strength now tempered by a quiet exhaustion, though even that did not diminish the steadiness in her gaze, the awareness that seemed to anchor her no matter how uncertain the moment became. "You should be afraid," he said after a long pause, his voice low, not as a warning, but as an observation, and she tilted her head slightly, as though considering the statement rather than reacting to it. "Fear requires uncertainty," she replied softly. "I am certain." The answer lingered, settling deeper than it should have, because it carried no bravado, no defiance, only a calm acceptance that felt far more dangerous than either. He studied her carefully, searching for the flaw in that certainty, the crack that would make her predictable, but found none, and that absence unsettled him more than any threat beyond his walls. "Certainty is often misplaced," he said, stepping closer once more, the distance between them narrowing with each measured step, until the flicker of the firelight caught the sharp lines of his expression, revealing something beneath his control, something quieter, sharper, and far more difficult to name. She did not retreat, did not look away, even as his presence pressed closer, her breath steady, her composure unbroken, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet weight that seemed to shift the very air around them. "Then you already know I am not wrong." The words struck deeper than he expected, because they did not challenge him. They acknowledged something he had already begun to accept, that whatever followed her to his gates would not be easily turned away. Outside, the storm howled louder, the wind striking against the tall windows with a force that made the glass tremble, and beneath that relentless sound came something else, faint but distinct, the echo of movement against snow, distant but closing. Sebastian's gaze shifted briefly toward the source, his instincts sharpening once more, not with hesitation, but with calculation, the kind that came from understanding that a line had already been crossed. When he looked back at her, there was no longer any attempt to dismiss her presence as temporary, no illusion that she would simply leave when the storm passed, because the storm was no longer the greatest threat within these walls. "If they come here," he said, his voice steady, controlled, though carrying a new weight beneath it, "they will find more than they expect." It was not a promise, not yet, but it carried the shape of one, and she seemed to recognize it, her gaze softening just enough to reveal something beneath her composure, something that might have been relief, or perhaps something deeper, something she had not allowed herself to show until now. "That is why they will not stop," she said quietly, and for a moment, the truth of it settled between them, clear and undeniable. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, but no longer detached, and turned slightly, as though aligning himself not with distance, but with the space she occupied, the shift subtle, but unmistakable. "Then they will learn," he said at last, his voice low, carrying a quiet finality that echoed through the chamber, "that this house does not yield." The fire flickered higher as if answering him, casting long shadows across the stone walls, and in that moment, something solidified between them, not trust, not yet, but a shared understanding that neither of them had sought, and neither of them could now escape, because the choice had already been made, and whatever came through those gates would not find the same man who had once ordered them closed without a second thought. The night stretched on without mercy, the storm outside growing louder as though it had found purpose in its fury, and within Blackthorn Hall that same sense of purpose had begun to take shape, quiet but undeniable, threading through every shadowed corridor and flickering flame. Sebastian did not leave the chamber, though the weight of responsibility pressed against him from every direction, because something held him there, something he refused to name, and yet could not ignore. She had not moved from her place near the fire, though the exhaustion in her posture had deepened, her shoulders slightly lowered, her strength no longer as sharp at the edges, and still, even in that fragile state, she carried herself with a composure that did not belong to someone who had arrived at his gates half frozen and alone. "You should sleep," he said after a long silence, his voice quieter now no longer shaped by command, but by something closer to intention, and she glanced at him briefly before lowering her gaze again, as though considering not the suggestion itself, but what it implied. Sleep is a luxury, she replied softly. It belongs to those who are not being followed. The words were simple, but they settled into the room with a weight that could not be dismissed. And Sebastian felt the truth of them in a way that went beyond logic, because he had known that same absence of rest, that same vigilance that refused to loosen its hold even in moments of supposed safety. He stepped closer to the fire, the warmth brushing against him without effect, his attention fixed on her in a way that no longer felt distant or detached, but deliberate, as if he were trying to understand not just her words, but the space between them. "This house does not fall easily," he said, his tone steady, though the assurance beneath it was meant as much for himself as it was for her, and she allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips, not one of comfort, but of recognition. "I do not doubt the house," she said. "I doubt what it protects." The answer lingered, sharp in its quiet honesty, and for a moment, something flickered across his expression, too brief to name, but enough to reveal that her words had reached deeper than he intended to allow. Outside, the wind howled again, louder this time, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of something shifting beyond. The gates, not random, not accidental, but measured, as though whatever approached was aware of where it needed to be. Sebastian's gaze lifted toward the high windows, his senses sharpening, every instinct drawing tight as he listened, not just to the storm, but to the silence within it, the kind of silence that followed intention. "They are closer now," he said, more to himself than to her, and this time, she did not answer immediately, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the blanket as though anchoring herself against something unseen. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a softness that had not been there before, not fear, but something quieter, something that came from knowing what could not be avoided. "They always are," she said, and the certainty in her words left no room for doubt. Sebastian exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, but no longer untouched, and for the first time, he did not resist the shift within him, did not attempt to return to the distance that had once defined him, because it was already gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, something that tied him to the presence before him in a way he had never intended. He turned fully toward her then, closing the remaining distance between them until the firelight cast both their shadows against the stone wall behind, merging and separating with each flicker of flame. And though he did not reach for her, did not cross that final boundary, his voice, when it came, was no longer that of a man observing from afar, but one who had already stepped into the path he could not leave. "Then you will not face them alone," he said quietly, and the words, once spoken, did not feel like a choice, but a truth that had been waiting beneath everything he had tried to remain. And in the silence that followed, something shifted once more, not in the storm beyond the walls, but within them, within him, because for the first time in years, he had not only allowed someone to remain, he had chosen to stand with them, and that choice carried a consequence he could not yet see, but could no longer deny. The fire had begun to dim again, its glow softer now, casting longer shadows that stretched across the stone floor and climbed the walls like silent witnesses to a moment neither of them had intended to reach, and yet neither could retreat from. Sebastian remained where he stood, close enough to feel the fragile warmth that surrounded her, far enough to preserve the boundary he had not yet crossed, though it had already begun to fade in ways he could not reverse. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before lowering, not out of submission, but as if she had accepted something unspoken between them, something that did not need to be named to exist. The storm outside pressed harder, a constant, unrelenting force that refused to weaken, and beneath it, that same subtle rhythm returned, the distant echo of movement against snow, closer now, deliberate, no longer concealed by the wind. Sebastian heard it clearly this time, his attention shifting with precision, every instinct aligning into focus, and for a brief moment, the man he had always been resurfaced, controlled, calculated, untouched by anything beyond necessity. But then his gaze returned to her, and that clarity fractured just enough to change everything. You knew this would happen, he said quietly, not accusing, but acknowledging, and she nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried the weight of certainty. I knew it would not stop, she replied, her voice softer now, touched by something more human, something that had not been there before. I did not know where it would end. The honesty in her words lingered between them, fragile and unguarded, and for the first time, he saw not just the calm strength she carried, but the quiet burden beneath it, the understanding that whatever she held had already cost more than she had revealed. He turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the doors as if measuring the distance between what was inside and what approached from beyond. But his focus did not remain there long, because something far more immediate held it in place. She shifted then, just enough to steady herself as she rose from her seat, the blanket slipping from her shoulders to reveal the weariness she could no longer fully conceal. And yet she stood, her posture straight despite the strain, her presence refusing to yield even now. You should not stand, he said, the words instinctive, quieter than he intended, and she met his gaze once more, something softer in her expression now, something that carried both understanding and quiet defiance. And you should not stay, she replied, the echo of his own restraint reflected back at him. The space between them tightened, not in distance, but in something far more intangible, something that neither of them could step away from. And for a moment, the storm outside seemed to fall silent, as if even it paused to witness the shift unfolding within the walls. Sebastian exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, but no longer untouched, and stepped closer, not out of impulse, but with a deliberate acceptance of what that movement meant, what it would change. This is no longer about what should happen, he said, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight that had not been there before. It is about what already has, the truth of it settled between them, undeniable and irreversible, and she held his gaze without retreat, without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for that acknowledgement, not from circumstance, but from him. Outside, the sound came again, closer now, unmistakable, no longer hidden within the storm, and this time, there was no question of what it meant. Sebastian's expression did not change, but something within it hardened, not into coldness, but into resolve, and without breaking eye contact, he spoke once more, his voice quieter than before, but carrying a certainty that echoed far beyond the room. They may have followed you here, he said, but they will not take you from it. The words settled into the space between them, not as a promise made lightly, but as something far deeper, something he had already chosen long before he allowed himself to say it aloud. And in that moment, as the storm closed in and the walls of Blackthorn Hall held steady against the night, the line between protector and prisoner blurred into something neither of them had intended, and neither of them could escape. The sound came again, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but deliberate, measured against the storm as though it moved with purpose rather than against it. And within the stone walls of Blackthorn Hall, that realization settled with a weight that could not be ignored. Sebastian did not turn toward the doors this time, did not rush to meet what approached, because something far more immediate held him in place, something that had already altered the course of everything within his control. She stood before him, steady despite the exhaustion that lingered in her posture, her presence no longer fragile, but anchored in a way that made the room feel smaller, more defined, as if her existence alone had shifted the boundaries of his world. They will not wait for daylight, she said quietly, her voice carrying a calm that contrasted sharply with the growing tension in the air, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging what he had already understood, what his instincts had confirmed long before her words gave it shape. Neither will I, he replied, his tone even, but no longer detached, because this was no longer a matter of observation, it was a matter of decision. The fire flickered higher for a moment, casting a sudden glow across the room, illuminating the fine lines of his expression, the quiet intensity in his gaze as it remained fixed on her, not as a stranger, but as something he had already begun to protect without fully understanding why. She drew a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table beside her as though grounding herself, and for the first time, there was something else beneath her composure. Something that resembled hesitation, not fear, but the weight of what had not yet been said. If they enter this house, she continued, her voice softer now, they will not come for me alone. The words lingered, heavier than anything she had revealed before, and Sebastian's gaze sharpened instantly, not with alarm, but with a deeper focus, as though a new piece of the pattern had fallen into place. Then you have withheld more than you admit, he said, his voice low, not accusing, but precise, and she did not deny it, did not retreat from the truth of his observation, only met his gaze. Once more with that same quiet certainty that had unsettled him from the beginning. Because some truths do not belong to one person, she replied, and there was something in her tone now that shifted the balance between them, something that suggested the weight she carried was not hers alone to give, and that alone was enough to deepen the silence that followed. Outside, the wind struck the walls again, harder this time, as if marking the passage of something unseen, something that had reached the threshold and now lingered just beyond it. Waiting, Sebastian turned then, finally, his attention drawn fully toward the doors, his posture shifting into something unmistakable, something that had nothing to do with hesitation and everything to do with readiness. They are here, he said, the words quiet, but carrying through the room with absolute clarity. And though he did not look back at her, he felt the shift in her presence, the subtle tightening of resolve that matched his own. The distance between them no longer mattered, because the moment had already drawn them into the same path, whether either of them had intended it or not. He took a step forward, then another, each movement deliberate, controlled, until he stood at the threshold that separated what was his from what sought to claim it. And for a brief moment, the silence returned, heavy, waiting, as though the world itself held its breath. Then, without turning, without hesitation, he spoke again, his voice lower now, carrying a quiet finality that echoed deeper than the storm itself. Stay where you are, he said, not as a command to be obeyed without question, but as something more personal, something that had already been decided long before the words left his lips. And behind him, she did not answer, but he knew she had heard, because the stillness that followed was no longer uncertain, it was deliberate, as if she, too, understood that whatever came next would not be something either of them could undo. And as the first faint echo of presence reached the doors of Blackthorn Hall, the truth settled fully into place. The night had changed. The house had changed, and so had the man who now stood, ready to defend both. The moment stretched thin as the sound beyond the doors settled into something unmistakable, no longer masked by the storm, but moving with intention, a quiet presence that pressed against the very edges of Blackthorn Hall as though testing its resolve. And Sebastian stood unmoving at the threshold, his hand resting against the cold iron, not in hesitation, but in control, because this was the moment where everything either held or broke. Behind him, the fire crackled faintly, the only warmth left in a room that now felt sharpened by anticipation, and though he did not turn, he was aware of her presence with a clarity that had nothing to do with sight, as if the space she occupied had become something fixed within his awareness, something he could not ignore even if he chose to. The silence deepened, and then came the sound, not forceful, not demanding, but deliberate, a measured knock against the heavy doors. Once, then again, each echo settling into the stone like a question that refused to be ignored. Sebastian's gaze did not waver, his posture unchanged, but something within him shifted, not into uncertainty, but into something far more defined, a clarity that came when choice was no longer abstract but immediate. You hear it. Her voice came softly from behind him, not asking, only acknowledging, and he inclined his head almost imperceptibly, his focus still fixed forward. I expected less patience, he replied, his tone even, though there was a faint edge beneath it now, something sharper, more alert. She took a slow step forward, the sound of her movement quiet against the stone, and though she did not come to stand beside him, the distance between them felt smaller, more deliberate, as if the space itself had adjusted to their shared awareness. They do not rush what they believe is already theirs, she said, and the certainty in her voice settled into the room with a weight that could not be dismissed. The knock came again, this time slightly louder, though no less controlled, and the storm outside seemed to pull back just enough for the sound to stand alone, clear and undeniable. Sebastian's hand tightened slightly against the iron, not in tension, but in decision, and without turning, he spoke, his voice low, carrying through the chamber with quiet authority. No one opens these doors without my command. The words were not directed at her alone, but at the house itself, at the unseen presence beyond, at everything that now pressed against the boundary he had chosen to hold. She did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice carried something new, something that had not been there before, a quiet understanding that matched his own. They will not ask twice, she said, and for a moment, the truth of that hung between them, unspoken but fully realized. Sebastian exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and then, with a movement that felt both inevitable and irreversible, he turned, not toward the doors, but toward her, his gaze meeting hers fully, without distance, without restraint. And in that moment, the storm, the presence beyond the walls, the weight of everything that approached, all seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet certainty that had taken hold between them. Then they will wait, he said, his voice lower now, carrying a calm that did not come from denial, but from decision. Because this house does not answer to them. The words settled between them, not as defiance, but as something far more grounded, something that had already begun to shape what would come next. Outside, the wind surged again, the storm reclaiming its voice, but beneath it, the presence remained, unmoved, unyielding, and within Blackthorn Hall, the line had been drawn, not by force, not by circumstance, but by the quiet, unwavering choice of a man who had finally stepped beyond the distance he had once believed would protect him, and now stood ready to face whatever had come to claim what he had already decided he would not surrender. The knock did not come again, and somehow that silence carried more weight than the sound itself, stretching across the stone walls and settling into the air like something patient, something certain of its place. And within that silence, Blackthorn Hall no longer felt like a fortress untouched by the world beyond, but a boundary that had already been acknowledged. Sebastian did not move from where he stood, though the absence of sound sharpened his awareness rather than easing it, because he understood now that what waited outside was not uncertain, it was deliberate, and that made it far more dangerous than any storm. Behind him, she remained still, her presence no longer shifting, no longer uncertain, but grounded in a way that suggested she had reached a point beyond hesitation, a place where what came next was no longer avoidable. "They are listening," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the faint crackle of the fire, and though the words might have unsettled another, Sebastian only inclined his head slightly, as though confirming what he had already begun to sense. "Then they will hear nothing they can use," he replied, his tone steady, controlled, but carrying a quiet edge that had not been there before, something sharper, more defined, and for a moment, the room seemed to respond to that shift, the shadows holding their place, the air itself tightening around the choice that had been made. She stepped closer then, not fully closing the distance, but enough that her presence no longer felt separate from his, and though her movements were quiet, there was no hesitation in them now, no uncertainty left to guide her steps. "You do not understand what they want," she said, and this time, there was something beneath her calm, something that bordered on urgency, though it remained controlled, contained, as though even that emotion had been carefully measured. Sebastian turned slightly toward her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Then explain it," he said, not as a demand, but as something inevitable, because whatever remained unsaid had already begun to shape everything around them. She held his gaze for a long moment, the firelight catching in her eyes, revealing something deeper than before, something that had been guarded until now, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet gravity that shifted the room once more. "They do not want me," she said. "They want what I refuse to give them." The words lingered, incomplete but heavy with meaning, and for the first time, Sebastian did not press immediately, because he understood that what she offered was not meant to be taken all at once, but revealed in fragments, each one carrying more weight than the last. "And you believe they will search this house for it," he said, his tone measured, though his focus had sharpened further, and she nodded slowly, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides. "They will search everything," she replied. Until they are certain. The certainty in her voice left no room for doubt, and for a moment, the silence returned, deeper now, heavier, as though both of them understood the implication of what had just been spoken. Sebastian exhaled slowly, his breath steady, controlled, but no longer untouched by what he now knew. And as he turned back toward the doors, his posture shifted once more, not into tension, but into something far more resolute, something that carried the quiet weight of decision fully realized. Then they will leave without it, he said, his voice low, unwavering, and behind him, she did not question the statement, did not challenge it, because something in his tone made it clear that this was no longer a matter of possibility, but of intent. Outside, the storm surged again, the wind rising against the walls with renewed force. But beneath it, the presence remained, unmoved, waiting, and within Blackthorn Hall, the line between what had been and what would come next had already been crossed, not by force, not by chance, but by a choice that neither of them could now undo. And as the silence held once more, heavier than before, the truth settled fully into place. Whatever stood beyond those doors had not come for a passing moment. It had come for something that now belonged within these walls, and whether he had intended it or not, Sebastian Blackthorn had already chosen to stand between it and the one who carried it. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching into something almost tangible, as though the air itself had grown aware of what stood on either side of the doors. And within that heavy stillness, every detail sharpened, the faint crackle of the fire, the distant breath of the storm, the quiet rhythm of two people who had already crossed a line neither of them could see before this night. Sebastian remained where he stood, his hand no longer resting on the iron, but hanging at his side, relaxed in a way that did not suggest ease, but control, the kind that came not from distance, but from acceptance. He understood now that whatever had come to his gates had not arrived by chance, and whatever stood behind him was no longer a matter of temporary shelter, but something far more permanent, far more binding than he had intended when he gave the order to open the gates. If they search this house, he said quietly, his voice steady, though the weight beneath it had shifted once more, they will not find what they expect. The statement was not defiance, not even confidence, but something far more grounded, something that had already been decided. Behind him, she drew a slow breath, and this time, when she stepped forward, she did not stop at a distance, but came to stand within the space beside him, not touching, but close enough that the warmth of her presence replaced the cold that had once defined his world. "You do not know that," she replied softly, and though her words carried truth, they no longer carried resistance, only a quiet acknowledgement of what he had chosen. He turned slightly toward her, his gaze steady, no longer searching, no longer questioning, because something in him had settled, something that did not require understanding to exist. "I know enough," he said, and in that moment, the meaning beneath those words became clear, not because of what he knew, but because of what he had accepted. Outside, the storm shifted again, the wind rising sharply against the walls, but beneath it, that same presence remained, unmoved, waiting with a patience that suggested it had no intention of leaving without what it sought. The absence of another knock was no longer uncertainty. It was certainty of a different kind, the kind that did not need to announce itself. She lowered her gaze briefly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her sleeve, a small movement, but one that revealed something she had not allowed before. A moment of hesitation that did not belong to fear, but to choice. "If they come inside," she said, her voice quieter now, "you may not be able to stop them from seeing." The words lingered, not as a warning, but as something closer to a confession, and for the first time, the weight of what she carried felt close enough to reach, though still just beyond understanding. Sebastian watched her for a moment, his expression unchanged, but something beneath it had shifted again, not into doubt, but into something far more deliberate. "Then they will see what I allow," he replied, and the quiet certainty in his voice settled deeper than anything before it, because it was no longer shaped by the boundaries of his house, but by the choice he had already made. Within it, she looked up at him then, fully, her gaze no longer guarded, no longer measuring, but open in a way that revealed something new, something that had not been there when she first crossed his threshold. And in that moment, the distance between them ceased to exist in any meaningful way, because what had formed between them no longer required space to define it. Outside, the wind pressed harder, the storm closing in as though drawn by the stillness within, and beneath it, the presence remained unchanged, waiting for a moment that had not yet come. Sebastian turned back toward the doors, his posture steady, unyielding, but no longer untouched by what stood behind him. And as the silence held once more, heavy and absolute, the truth settled fully into place. This was no longer a matter of keeping something out. It was a matter of protecting something within, and whether he had intended it or not. That distinction had already become the only thing that mattered. The silence finally broke, not with force, but with presence, as the heavy doors trembled slightly under a pressure that was neither violent nor uncertain, but deliberate, as though whatever stood beyond had decided the waiting was over. And within that single moment, everything inside Blackthorn Hall seemed to draw inward, the air tightening, the fire dimming, the world narrowing to the space between what stood outside and what remained within. Sebastian did not move at first, his gaze fixed forward, his posture unyielding. But something in him had already shifted beyond the need for hesitation. Because the choice he had made was no longer something he could reconsider, it had become something he would defend. Beside him, she stood without retreat, her presence no longer marked by distance or caution, but by a quiet steadiness that mirrored his own, as if whatever had brought her here had already shaped her for this moment. The sound came again, not a knock this time, but a subtle, undeniable pressure against the boundary itself, and in that quiet insistence, the truth settled fully into place. They would not leave without certainty. "This is where it ends," she said softly, not as a declaration, but as an understanding, and for a brief moment, the weight of her words hung between them, fragile and final. Sebastian turned to her then, fully, his gaze meeting hers without distance, without the restraint that had once defined him. And in that moment, the storm, the presence beyond the walls, everything that had pressed against this night, seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet clarity of what had already been decided. "No," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying a certainty that did not come from denial, but from something far deeper. "This is where it begins." The words settled into the space between them, reshaping it, redefining it, and something in her expression shifted, not into relief, not into fear, but into something that had not existed before, something that belonged only to this moment. The doors trembled once more, the pressure building, the storm outside rising to meet it, and Sebastian turned back without another word, his hand lifting at last to the iron, not to open it, but to claim it, to anchor himself to the boundary he had chosen to hold. Behind him, she remained still, her presence no longer separate, no longer uncertain, but bound to the choice he had made, whether she had intended it or not. "If they see me," she said quietly, her voice carrying through the rising wind, "they will not stop." And for a moment, the truth of that settled into the room, clear and undeniable. But Sebastian did not hesitate, did not turn back, because the answer had already formed long before she spoke. "Then they will learn," he replied, his voice calm, unshaken, "that there are things they cannot take." The finality of his words did not rise, did not demand, but settled with a weight that could not be moved, because it was no longer about the house, or the storm, or whatever waited beyond the doors. It was about the line he had chosen to draw, and the one person he had already decided would remain within it. Outside, the storm surged, the presence pressed forward, and inside, the fire flickered once more, casting their shadows together against the stone, no longer separate, no longer uncertain, but intertwined in a way neither of them had sought, and neither of them could undo. And as the night held its breath at the edge of something inevitable, one truth remained, quiet but unbreakable. Some men spend their lives guarding what they were given, but others only discover what they are meant to protect the moment they almost lose it. And in that single choice, everything changes, whether the world beyond the door accepts it or not.